Hey guys, Brian Stevens here with the National Real Estate Post.
You know, I keep wondering what could be that one unforeseen or little discussed thing that could make our inevitable recession even worse. After all, the housing market is strong. The Fed believes it will sustain all of us. In fact, our economy is doing pretty good despite that little inflation thing. So a recession is coming and we all know that, but I keep thinking it might be worse than anticipated. Now, I could be wrong, but I've been thinking about a few things and I'm going to share them with you to see what you guys think about it. So, you know how I see it, the idea of sanctions is to try to compel a country into a specific action, like to stop invading another country or to lay off the internationally recognized human rights violations. However, in recent months, it seems like sanctions now have acted as a proxy for war, meaning with world events everyone knows we can't have a world war and throw nukes at each other, so the alternative to a war is sanctions. That means sanctions are now intended to hurt rather than compel, and that's a fundamental difference. From Stuart Davis's Sanctions of War. Since the 1980s, the United States has steadily increased its reliance on economic sanctions or the imposition of extensive financial penalties for violation of given rules to fight its foreign policy battles. Perceived as a less costly and damaging alternative to kinetic military engagement, economic sanctions have been levied against over 25 countries. So what does that look like and how is it affecting the world right now? And mark this point, sanctions as the new alternative to war is not just something that the United States is doing. First point, Russia. The United States and the European Union sanctions have been nothing short of oppressive. And just a couple of days ago, the European Union set the harshest Russian sanctions targeting oil and insurance on Russian shipping. You know how Russia and the rest of the world get stuff from one country to another country, the ones who need it. Now shipping, this is one matter that's affecting our international supply disruptions. And as you can see from this graph on the Russian economy, the speed, depth, and breadth of the international sanctions imposed have severely impaired economic output. Drastically, significantly. What's the result? Russia just failed to meet bond obligations, triggering swap payouts. What does that mean? Well, the cost of insuring against a Russian default has just spiked, making it a veritable impossibility, leaving the Russian population and government vulnerable to major disruptions. So now we move to China. Can't fight China in a war, can we? But we can use sanctions as an act of war. In fact, China just came out and said that the United States supply chain curbs sabotage China's development. And China goes on to say such moves gravely undermine the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies and deprive China of its right to development, and that such a strategy would only push the world's two largest economies to confrontation and conflict. So how does this affect the world? Look no further than Sri Lanka, believe it or not. Understand, Sri Lanka's default hints at trouble ahead for developing nations. They just defaulted on $12.6 billion in bonds, which will end up with billions coming from the International Monetary Fund to keep the nation out of chaos and food availability for its citizens. And more on that in a second. There are 13 nations that are deemed critical on default on their debt, and at least another 50 that are deemed high risk, meaning the best is yet to come with developing nations. Why are these countries going into default? Well, this one's easy. Either pay your debt or feed your population, an impossible choice for poor countries. After Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt, Jack McIntyre, a portfolio manager at Brandywine Global Investment Management, started watching rice and grain prices more closely. For a swath of the markets he's tracking, global food shortages are presenting governments with a stark choice: pay their debt or feed their people. Now here's a chart of the price of rice, the staple food for half the world. It's pretty scary, isn't it? Here's the price of grain. You know, all the stuff we can't get from the Ukraine and all the stuff that India has now officially quit exporting to the rest of the world. You know, the stuff that the other half of the world eats as its staple. Look at its price. Also pretty scary, and both getting worse. Do you think it's a coincidence that the Biden administration just earmarked $2 billion in funds for the sole purpose of strengthening our food supply chain? Why? Because most of the industrial world has imposed sanctions more as an act of war, and the world is starting to feel the effects. Now, it's always going to start with poor countries, isn't it? Like Sri Lanka. They're the canary in the coal mine. But more will follow, and the International Monetary Fund will not be able to deal with 30 countries who default on all their debt. And these problems are eventually going to find their way to us. What does that look like? Well, I don't know. But as Jamie Dimon of Chase just said, for us to brace ourselves because an economic hurricane is coming. Now, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but it sure does look stark to me from this perspective. For me, for you, I guess it's just as simple as save your money and make sure that your supply of rice and beans is better now than it's ever been before. Because when bread gets to $10 a loaf, things are going to get crazy.